and welcome to the South East Rivers Trust series of webinars, The Story of Rivers. This is episode 7 and it's all about road runoff. All of our previous episodes are shared via our YouTube channel and the Cert River Club Facebook page. The South East Rivers Trust is a grassroots environmental charity dedicated to improving rivers across the southeast of England. If you have any questions during or after the webinar, please remember you can type them in the Facebook comments below and we'll do our best to do a Q&A session with a panel of our expert staff soon. So your presenters today are Sam and Emma, so I'll leave them to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Samantha Hughes. I'm the Project Development Manager at the South East Rivers Trust. I've worked in and around rivers for about 33 years now in different places around the world.
And I'm Emma, and I've been working for the Trust for about 9 months as a London Rivers Officer. So I help support the catchment partnerships for some of our lovely London rivers, the Wandle, the Hogsmill and the Beverley Brook, and also get involved with a bit of the engagement on those rivers as well. Okay, so today we are going to cover these basic points about road runoff. So what is road runoff? How does it get into our rivers? Why is it such a problem? And what can we do about it? Okay, so what is road runoff? Essentially, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the water that runs off of our roads when it rains. Because the road surfaces are impermeable and may be surrounded by other impermeable surfaces like pavements and buildings, rainwater can't permeate back into the ground to recharge the aquifer. So it makes its way into our rivers via the surface water drainage network instead. As it runs off the roads, it takes with it anything and everything that's on the road surface. Obviously, the amount of water and the speed at which it enters the river is affected by the amount and duration of rainfall. But it's also affected by things like the surrounding land use and the slope of the land. So, for example, vegetated buffer strips and unpaved ground can slow the flow of water and allow some of it to drain back into the ground. So how does it get into the rivers? This map here shows 2 different sewer systems. So in some areas, typically older cities with older sewer systems like central London, which you can see here in the light blue, there's a combined sewer system. So the surface water drainage network is linked into the sewage network, and all of the water is taken together to a sewage treatment works. I think Jess and Polly covered this quite well in one of their previous webinars. So if you haven't watched that, you can look back and recap on how that works. So sometimes when it rains heavily, this combined sewer system can become overloaded, and the excess sewage, and including the road runoff, can spill over into our rivers. But for most other areas of the UK, like the areas you can see in green on the map, there are 2 separate sewer systems. So this means that when it rains, all of the pollutants from the road and other hard surfaces are washed down the drain and they go straight out into the river. What is in road runoff? So as you might have gathered, it doesn't just contain rainwater, it's full of pollutants that can harm river ecosystems. There are an estimated 300 different pollutants that enter our rivers via road runoff, and this includes things like heavy metals, ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, aldehydes, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These pollutants mostly come from vehicles, things like exhaust fumes, brakes, tyres, corroded bodywork, and wear on the road surface. But other features like roadside infrastructure, signage and barriers, and also rainwater coming off of building roofs and from industrial areas can also add pollutants to the runoff. Often, the first few minutes of heavy rain has the biggest impact, as everything that's on the road gets washed into the river really rapidly. And this is particularly bad after a long dry spell of weather, when pollutants have built up and the river level's low. So the water that's entering the river is carrying more pollutants from the roads, and the river has less water in it to dilute those. Because there are so many pollutants in road runoff, we're just going to take a look at some of the ones that are best understood and best studied in terms of their damage to our waterways. So what's in road runoff? There are an estimated 32 million passenger cars on UK roads, and a study from 2000 estimated that 16,000 tonnes of oil per year are released into the UK environment from leaks and oil spills from collisions. So to start off, we'll look at polyaromatic hydrocarbons. These are a class of organic compounds that are found in crude oil, and they're generated primarily through the incomplete combustion of fuel and from oil from spills and leaks. Next up, we have heavy metals. So these include things like zinc, copper, lead, mercury, cadmium, and nickel. And they're released into the environment from lots of different sources. Most of these are on vehicles, so things like brakes, exhaust, oils, tyres, and bodywork. But metal roofs and road infrastructure also play a big part in these heavy metals making their ways into rivers. And finally, accumulated dirt and dust. So organic degradable matter, natural matter, and inorganic matter also make their way from roads into our rivers. So why is it a problem? Well, heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and many of the other pollutants in road runoff are toxic to fish, mammals, invertebrates, and birds. And some of these you'll probably already know well for their toxicity to humans, such as lead and mercury. These two metals, along with cadmium, have no known essential role in living organisms, so they exhibit extreme toxicity, even at very low exposure levels. And other metals such as zinc, copper, and nickel are essential trace metals, but typically the levels that they're found in road runoff are far exceed that which is needed for growth and reproduction, so they're also highly toxic. Once in the water, fish and other aquatic organisms ingest these pollutants or absorb them through permeable membranes like their gills, and lacking the ability to process and excrete them, they're stored in the tissues and internal organs, and they can affect the growth, behaviour and reproduction, and can even be lethal above certain levels. So heavy metals, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and many other chemicals and compounds that enter our rivers through road runoff can bioaccumulate in the food chain. And this means that predators further up the food chain end up with very high levels in their bodies from eating lots of small animals that have absorbed or ingested smaller amounts of those pollutants. And these pollutants also persist in the environment and accumulate in river sediment. So they're particularly damaging to bottom-dwelling organisms, and the negative effects can be exacerbated by the modification of rivers, where structures like weirs cause impoundment and stop the natural process of sediment movement. And you can learn more about that on one of our previous webinars. So all of these pollutants are not just a worry for river wildlife, they can affect human health too, making their way into our drinking water by leaching through the ground into the underground aquifers that our water is abstracted from. So in order to tackle road runoff, looking at the bigger picture is really essential. The sewer network and the road network are complex systems that don't respect boundaries, and neither does traffic. So really we need to look at not just even the river catchment scale, but also consider these wider road networks and sewage networks, so we can understand how surface water is moving through the landscape and through those road and sewer networks, and identify where it's causing the most harm and where we might be able to mitigate against that. So working in partnership with other organisations is essential, and catchment partnerships and other partnership groups are excellent tools for doing this. And they bring together people from water companies, the transport industry, topic experts, landowners, and with all those people involved, we can identify the best solutions and potentially address multiple issues at the same time, like creating new habitats for wildlife and also access to nature for people. So Sam is now going to cover some of the potential solutions for addressing road runoff.
So Emma has talked about and given us background on road runoff, where it comes from, what it's made of, and where it ends up. I'm going to talk about how we tackle the problem of road runoff and some of the solutions that we use at CERT and are also used by other organisations. I'm going to talk about grey and green infrastructures. Grey infrastructures are hard engineering solutions to intercepting road runoff, and green infrastructures like constructed wetlands are nature-based solutions for intercepting and treating runoff. in this slide, there's some information on the Downstream Defender. The Downstream Defender is basically a very large drum that's installed underground in urban areas where there's not very much space, for example, a wetland. And it basically slows down the flow of a road runoff that passes into it. It loses energy and the contaminated sediments drop out into the bottom of Downstream Defender. So in the photograph on the right, you can see one of the larger Downstream Defenders that's been installed by CERT. This one is 3.5 meters wide and 5 meters deep and was installed in Richmond Park to intercept road runoff going into the Beverley Brook. It's captured about 5,000 kilos of contaminated sediment since it was installed. The efficiency of a Downstream Defender really depends on the catchment it's in and the type of flow rates going into it and the particle size, the types of particles that go into it. And it's the pollutants that adhere to particles and sediments that are being retained in the drum. So here's just some summary information on a Downstream Defender. The photographs on the right show sampling, a sampling run from upstream as the water goes into a Downstream Defender, so over time. So imagine these samples are taken every 5 minutes. It shows on the left in the top photograph the suspended sediments in the first flush, which is that very heavily polluting part of a phase after rainfall, when road runoff is washed into the rivers. And then over time, it gradually goes down. The photograph on the bottom shows the outflow from the Downstream Defender. And you can see that basically sediments are being retained inside the Downstream Defender. There are much lower levels of contaminated sediments in the sample. The graph on the left shows the blue line shows the sediments going into the Downstream Defender when there's a rainfall event, and runoff is basically pushed through the sewage system down towards a water body, and the brown line shows basically what is coming out of the other side of the Downstream Defender. So this shows that it's very efficient in retaining contaminated sediments. And that, of course, is beneficial to the environment. So there's some more information on the Downstream Defender. Here's some photographs. The photograph on the left shows the type of material and sediment that ends up in the Downstream Defender. It's a mixture of what we call floatables and non-floatables. So you'll have leaves floating on the surface, and then at the bottom you'll have contaminated sediments and sludge. And if these are then sent off for analysis, they will have very, very high levels of contaminants. And they're being held back in the Downstream Defender and obviously being prevented from contaminating freshwater ecosystems downstream of where the Downstream Defender has been fitted. Obviously, these infrastructures have to be maintained, and at some point they'll fill up with sediment and they have to be emptied. And this is a photograph of the Downstream Defender in Richmond Park being emptied last summer. And that involves basically getting a very large tube attached to a special lorry and pumping the sediment out. It was actually done. It's not a messy process at all. It was very, very well done. So I've covered just one type of grey infrastructure, the Downstream Defender. There are other types of hard engineered infrastructures for intercepting runoff, but that's the one that we use and have been testing and assessing at the South East Rivers Trust for a few years now. The other type of infrastructure for intercepting road runoff is the green infrastructures, and specifically the constructed wetland. Constructed wetlands are very versatile. They can be used, obviously in this case, for trapping road runoff contaminants, but they can also be used to trap nutrients and hold back nutrients. And they can also be used to mitigate flood risk because they slow down the flow in a catchment system. Apart from that, they have benefits like carbon sequestration. They promote biodiversity. You'll often find a lot of invertebrates and birds around these systems. They obviously are used to improve water quality, and in the landscape setting, they're nice to look at, and they're pleasant places to be around. So they're very good for well-being. At CERT, we use constructed wetlands to intercept road runoff. We have the Richmond Park Golf Course constructed wetland that was built in 2016. It was basically an ornamental pond situated in the golf course that was adapted to become a constructed wetland. It has a sediment trap at the top of the systems that holds some of the contaminated sediment going through this stream. And then there are two constructed wetlands further downstream. So this slows the flow right down, and the sediments, the contaminated sediments, drop out into these systems. The photograph on the lower right shows the wetland not long after it was constructed in 2016, and it's just been planted up. Some results from studies on this constructed wetland show that some of the contaminants, the heavy metals, chromium, copper, lead and zinc, all appear to come from a common source, and that is probably the nearby road network. One thing that's very noticeable about these studies on road runoff, whether it's a constructed wetland or a grey infrastructure, is that aluminium behaves very differently to all of the other heavy metals and tends to be in very high concentrations. In the study on this constructed wetland, we also found that whereas most of the heavy metals were held further upstream in this system, aluminium behaved differently and was found in higher concentrations in the lower end of this system. So there's a lot of work and interesting research to be done there about how and why these contaminants behave differently. There's also an awful lot of golf balls in these, which is nice because we give them back to the golfers. So I've given examples of grey and green infrastructures in an isolated way to show how they work and what they do and what they look like. But obviously, as Emma said, pollution, especially in an urban setting, doesn't know boundaries. We're living in very altered systems, and this affects people and organisations in a different way. So CERT is working collaboratively with a number of organisations that you can see on this slide that all have different interests or different approaches in tackling road runoff. This group of organisations has been looking at how to map road runoff hotspot areas where there are hotspots around London for pollutants, and then targeting these areas to get into contact with local authorities and local interest groups to start generating interest and engagement in ways to mitigate these impacts. And one of these approaches is looking at green spaces in the area where there are these pollution hotspots, and starting to have dialogue about the possibility of constructing wetlands.
Thanks, guys. Just a reminder, if you've watched this and have any questions, please type them in the Facebook comments below. Next time our webinar is all about natural flood management, something that maybe some of you have heard of but don't know anything about in detail. So it'll be really interesting to get Ed and Dean to talk a bit about that and how it works and some of the multiple benefits that it provides. I hope you've all enjoyed this episode of The Story of Rivers, and I hope we'll see you again soon.